Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into some truly fascinating historical analysis. We're taking a deep dive into Chapter 7 of the book The Death of Utopia, which subjects the Communist Party of the Philippines, or the CPP, to a rigorous, completely impartial scientific test. You see, what the book does here is take this ideology entirely out of the realm of pure political rhetoric and places it under a philosophical microscope. It asks a very direct, hard-hitting question. What actually happens when a promised utopia collides head-on with cold, hard historical facts?
All right, here is our roadmap for putting this ideology to the test today. We'll start with the falsification test, then we'll walk through three big historical predictions: the inevitable revolution, the peasant uprising, and the strategic offensive, before wrapping it all up with a final Popperian verdict.
Let's kick things off with Part 1, the falsification test, Karl Popper's rule.
To really dissect these claims, the book relies heavily on the philosopher Karl Popper. Now, Popper spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to tell actual science apart from pseudoscience or dogma. And according to the author, Popper's central game-changing insight is that an ideology absolutely must admit error. This is the principle of falsifiability. Basically, for any theory to be considered truly scientific, you have to be able to say, okay, if X happens, my theory is wrong. If an ideology completely seals itself off from criticism and just explains away every single failure, well, it ceases to be science and becomes pure dogma. The author uses this exact lens to evaluate the CPP's claim that they practice scientific socialism. So, let's look at the hypothesis and see how this all builds. The CPP built its entire foundation on these three scientific promises, which we are going to test against the historical evidence. And keep in mind, according to the source, these weren't just casual guesses. No, these were taught to cadres as ironclad guarantees, the absolute predetermined direction of history. Moving right along to Part 2, Prediction 1, the inevitable revolution. Our first major test examines the prediction that a violent revolution in the Philippines was absolutely guaranteed by the laws of history. The foundational texts declared that the masses would naturally, inevitably rise up against the system. But the author contrasts this prediction of unavoidable war with the reality on the ground today, and what we see is citizens increasingly choosing peace and progress. The book points out that instead of a nationwide mass uprising, history actually delivered a massive rejection of armed struggle by the exact communities that were supposed to be leading it. The evidence shows local peace engagements dismantling guerrilla fronts and surrenderies massively outnumbering new recruits. Now, it's pretty incredible to see how this philosophy is grounded in tangible reality. The book highlights case studies of barangays that literally chose concrete farm-to-market roads over rifles. You can really see how basic infrastructure fundamentally changes the entire dynamic of an area. When remote communities get connected, they choose development. So the inevitable revolution, as the author argues, was basically halted by simple, tangible progress. All right, Part 3, Prediction 2, the Peasants' Uprising. Based on a Maoist framework straight out of the 1960s, the ideology predicted that the peasantry would rise up as the unwavering main force of the revolution. Why? Because the theory said their economic conditions would just keep getting worse and worse. But the book argues that the playbook totally failed here because it completely ignored the rapid urbanization and economic shifts that transformed the Philippines. Since the 1970s, the country didn't just remain a static agrarian society. Instead, you had agrarian reform, distributing millions of hectares of land. On top of that, millions of Filipinos became overseas Filipino workers, sending huge remittances back home. And the business process outsourcing, or BPO sector, came in and created a massive new middle class. The so-called peasantry wasn't sinking. They were actively experiencing major upward mobility. So how does the ideology handle this massive shift? Well, when confronted with this upward mobility, the ideology reportedly just dismisses the people's improved lives as false consciousness, refusing to accept the data altogether. The author points out that instead of adjusting their theory to match the new reality of call center agents and overseas workers, the framework insists that these improvements are just a trick. It's a fascinating and kind of wild psychological defense mechanism, actively rejecting lived reality just to protect the written doctrine. Which brings us to Part 4, Prediction 3, the Strategic Offensive. Here is our third and final test, evaluating the predicted military advancement to the new People's Army. The ideology promised a very specific, phased military progression that would inevitably topple the state. The timeline, mapped out back in the 1970s, promised a really quick progression.
They predicted they'd hit the strategic stalemate in the 1980s and the strategic offensive by the 1990s. Yet, the empirical data presented in the book shows them trapped in the very first phase, the strategic defensive, over half a century later. The timeline just completely collapsed.
When we step back and look at the collapse of all three of these predictions, we're basically left staring at the posters of a failed prophecy. The grand promises of an inevitable revolution, a rising peasant class, and a triumphant military offensive simply did not materialize the way the doctrine guaranteed they would. And, going back to Karl Popper's standard, a scientific theory that makes three massive predictions that all fail like this, it should be completely discarded.
Let's wrap this all up with part 5, the final Popoverian verdict.
Since these predictions clearly failed the scientific test, we have to look at how the CPP actually reacts to that reality. Notice what Popper calls immunizing stratagems in action right here. When the data fails the hypothesis, they change the explanation instead of changing the theory. If there's no mass uprising, they don't admit the theory is wrong, they just say the mass base is weak. If fighters voluntarily surrender, well, they claim they must have been abducted. If communities choose the government, they blame it on state psychological warfare. They are constantly immunizing the doctrine from ever being proven wrong. The author uses this incredibly striking phrase to explain the psychological mechanism of a closed society. It's a system that protects its own infallibility at the direct expense of its followers. Think about it. If the ideology can literally never be wrong, then the fault must always lie with the people. They are insufficiently aroused, or they're spies, or they're suffering from false consciousness. The doctrine gets to remain perfect on paper, while real, everyday human beings get blamed because reality didn't match the script. I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought from the author. If history isn't actually driving the revolution, and if these scientific predictions have all failed, then the violence used in its name loses its ultimate historical justification. It strips away the comforting illusion of destiny, and it leaves behind a stark, deeply unsettling reality about the choices made in the name of a failed utopia. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning and keep learning.